All right, so just want to formally welcome you to our training today on compassionate support, understanding trauma and trauma-informed care. And I am actually going to pass it over to my colleague, Priscilla.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. Please feel free to use the chat to have conversations, to chat with us. While I'm presenting, Ashley's going to be engaging with everyone in the chat. I do have a little bit of a cold, so please bear with me if I have to mute myself and have a cough or two. Okay, so the things that we're going to be going over today are learning objectives. In this session, like Ashley said, if you missed session 1, please go back and take a look at it. It provides a little bit of groundwork for this session, but you can definitely still engage if you haven't seen session 1. So today we're going to be describing the impacts of sexual assault trauma, going over the basics of trauma-informed care. We're going to be demonstrating some trauma-informed practices and going over how to assess appropriate community supports. So first, we're going to start off with understanding trauma. And I want to start out by asking you all a question. If you could engage with us in the chat and just kind of think about a time that you supported someone through a trauma. It could be, like a death of a family member or a car accident, sexual violence, just anything that was really jarring to that person or something traumatic, and think about how you responded to that. What was the most helpful for them? And what do you feel like was the most important thing for you to do in those moments? So if you could just kind of take a minute, think about what your reactions were anytime you felt like you had to support someone. What did you feel like was most helpful in those moments? So if anyone can put in the chat what your reactions to those were, and I'll skip to the next slide while you all are kind of thinking about what was helpful and what was important, and talk about trauma. But before we talk about responses to trauma, it's important to understand what exactly trauma is. So in this definition, trauma is a response to a deeply disturbing or distressing event that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. It can cause feelings of helplessness. It can diminish their sense of self and their ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. So an important thing to remember in this and what we're talking about today is trauma can overwhelm someone's ability to cope, can actually shut down the prefrontal cortex, which is the logic and reasoning area of the brain. So it's important to know that, trauma is this really overwhelming act that happens to someone or a response that happens. So going back to our chat, it looks like presence and validation. From Crystal saying like just being present and validating their feelings and their emotions and their experience is what was the most helpful to someone. And then Stephen saying shielded from the media and protected identity somewhat. Okay, great. Yeah, that's something that is super important, right? If there's a media presence in that person's life, or even like media about that person's experience, right? Trying to make sure that you're not, that you're protecting their identity, and also possibly that like protecting them from triggers. Ashley's saying that listening to them and not asking questions that I didn't need to know the answers to. Yes, that's a really important one too, because our instincts kind of is like to ask a person to share what happened, right? To find out what the experience was, what the details are, because when we get stuck on something or something big like this happens, we don't always know how to respond. It's normal to ask questions, right? But trying to remember, like, this isn't necessarily what's important. We want to know like how the person is feeling and make sure we're validating them and just being there for them. So yeah, thank you all for sharing those responses. So before I go to the next slide, I just want to let you all know I'm going to be sharing a video in this next slide. This is a trigger warning. It'll be a demonstration about our body's reactions to danger. And this video does involve a snake. So I want to warn you, if you're sensitive about snakes, maybe, look away for a few moments. The video is very short. It's only about 10 seconds. But there is also a jump scare. There's a louder noise that will happen. But I just want to give you all a trigger warning for that before we continue. So it's something that is meant to startle you. So just kind of take a look at this, but be aware. Okay, so in the chat, can anyone give me a description of that video and how it made them feel, what their responses in their body was, if they felt any kind of reaction happening? Does anyone in the chat have an answer? How did your body feel? Even though you had a warning about what was going to happen, did you notice that you were still startled? Chills, okay. Ashley saying that she's seen it a million times and she knows what's coming, but still jumps at the end. Revulsion, okay. Hopefully that didn't affect anyone too terribly. And anticipation, that causes some anxiety leading up to the noise. Yes. So those are all great responses, right? And it really demonstrates that even if you feel like you're prepared for something and something's going to happen, right? Our bodies are not fully able to be controlled by our minds, right? Sometimes that trauma response can take over and it can cause these reactions that you maybe don't anticipate or that you can't control, you don't expect. And like Stephen's saying, even if you do know exactly what's going to happen, right? You know that you're waiting for something, but just having that knowledge sometimes can be triggering, right? That can give you anxiety. Imagine if that was, an hour-long video, right? And I just tell you at some point there's going to be this thing. So they're starting to realize that like trigger warnings, while they may be important for some people, for other people, they can actually cause increased anxiety because you're just sitting there the whole time, like wondering, when is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? So that's just kind of a little bit of a demonstration of how our bodies respond to things, even if we're prepared for them. So thank you all for participating in that. So trauma is an event that can be so overwhelming, your body sets up defenses in order to deal with the trauma. So in these instances, people have lost control. So trauma-informed care really allows them the space to regain control. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, all about trauma and trauma-informed care and trauma-informed responses. So trauma is also life organizing, which means that it can make a definitive change in your life, like marking time as before the event or after the event. And with more complex trauma that lasts a long time or is continuous, such as ongoing sexual assault, these things can have even more lasting effects. This can lead to complex trauma, which can need more time to process and more time to support being able to like integrate that trauma into your life and integrate the healing. So trauma responses, we're going to talk about what happens when people are faced with trauma or danger. And we talk about these as the 4 F's of trauma responses. And you may be familiar with some of these already. Fight or flight, right? That's ones that were pretty common to hear about when you're addressed with danger, right? When danger approaches you, you have that fight or flight response. But there's 2 additional ones that we see people responding to as well. And those are freeze and fawn. And fawn is not as much of a trauma response as kind of a reaction after your trauma response fails. But these are the way that our body responds to trauma as a way to protect itself. And sometimes people have a dominant trauma response, but that response can also change based on the circumstances, or sometimes there's more than one response, especially like if it's something that happens continuously over time. Your body may respond one way, and if that doesn't work, then another time it may respond a different way. But if you notice any of these reactions arise as you're working with someone, that may mean that they're feeling triggered, right? They may be experiencing memories of their trauma. So you want to try to reconnect with them and ground them, doing things like asking them how they're feeling, seeing what you're noticing, saying, it seems like something is upsetting you right now. Would you like to talk about it? What do you need to feel better right now? Those kinds of responses, if you're noticing, someone acting in a way that doesn't seem appropriate for the situation, right? Like something may have happened and it's triggered their trauma response, but you may not be expecting that that's their response to that specific incident. Okay, so we'll start out going a little bit deeper into fight. Can anyone name an animal that you think of in the world that like uses their fight mechanism, right? That when you think of like an animal that protects itself by fighting, what would be one that you would think of? I have cats here, but something that I think of is like a lion, right? A lion is something that you think of is very like predatorial, very aggressive kind of, and they're going to protect themselves in a way of like fighting against the danger. Are there other ones that you guys can think of in the chat? A wolf. Great. Yeah. A wolf is very predatorial. A rooster, Stephen. Yeah. A bear. Yes. Okay. So things that can be very, very aggressive. Yeah. So in the moment when someone is experiencing a fight, Ashley saying she has a rooster that's like that. Our farm friend, Ashley, she probably has animals to demonstrate every single one of these trauma responses. So in the moment, fight can look like confrontational, right? Sometimes physical violence. Fight is something that's high on connectivity, but it's low on safety or refuge. So they may be using like physical contact in order to get out of danger, but they're not seeking refuge, right? They're not running away. And they're trying to regain their control of the situation through physicality. So this is something that like a self-defense class, that's why people say self-defense can be helpful for assaults, because it can help you with that muscle memory so that fight becomes more of an instinct for folks who maybe that's not their trauma response. And at best, fight response can look like assertiveness or like keeping good boundaries. So there's sometimes, a positive outcome to this fight response, right? Like in your everyday life, that may come out like being assertive or being courageous or leadership, but at worst it can be like combative or aggressive. So those are things that we kind of want to be aware of when people are feeling triggered over something, that we may see these kinds of behaviors or reactions start to come out. What about flight? Are there animals that you can think of that use flight as their means of safety or their means of escaping danger? I have a rabbit up here, right? That's something that when it's scared, it just runs away, right? Tries to escape. It flees the area. It's high on refuge and low on connection. So they're not seeking to make a connection with the cause of danger, either in a protective way by physically harming it or in any other way. Does anyone have any examples in the chat for something that flees away? This is really something that, like the physical readiness comes into your body. All the blood is going maybe like away from your logical thinking mind and going to your limbs so that it can get you out of that situation. A mouse, Ashley, yeah. Cats maybe flee, yeah, right? Some cats. I think of also like animals with long legs, like gazelles or deer, right? They hear a noise, like they may run away, but also um, deer have a tendency to have the freeze mechanism as well. So, but animals with long legs, horses, gazelles, right? They do flee when they're in danger. And at best, flight can, because it's high on refuge and low on connection, it can look like perseverance. It can look like a healthy retreat from a situation that they know is damaging. But at worst, it can lead to things like panicking, worrying, micromanaging. It can lead to like excessive, like overthinking situations, focusing on perfectionism, maybe withdrawing from situations. So if you start to notice these kinds of reactions, it might be that a person is dealing with some trauma. The next one is freeze. So I have an opossum here, right? An opossum is a really good, or possum as some people will pronounce it, you know, there's different ways. But an opossum is an animal that, right, they have that phrase like playing possum, right? Because it's an animal that pretends to be dead, right? Its mechanism in trauma is to literally just freeze, right? Pretend that it's not alive anymore to get the danger to pass the situation. So the body freezes in order to let the danger pass. And in the moment, it looks like an inability to move, to say anything, to ask for help. So we see this oftentimes in sexual assault cases where people are like, well, did you say no? Did you ask for help? Did you, like, what did you do? What was your response? But people have this trauma response, right? A freeze is a legitimate trauma response where your reaction is simply to just wait for the danger to pass, right? Knowing that hopefully eventually this will go away. And so this response is really at the cross section of low connection with the person and high safety. So you may even be experiencing like detachment from the situation. It best when you're having a trauma response, it can look like acute awareness, mindfulness, maybe even like peace or presence or detachment. If this is your like ongoing trauma response and you're feeling triggered. But some of the problems that it can cause in your ongoing life is like hiding or camouflaging or isolating, right? Becoming like spacey or staying away from people and situations out of a fear that they're going to be harmed. And this is also one that I think of deer, right? Deer have that like deer in the headlights where they get harmed or they get triggered or there's some kind of traumatic event and they just freeze. Same thing with goats, right? The fainting goats that you see sometimes, they get startled and then they just faint because it's easier to sometimes let that danger just pass than to confront it head on or to try and escape it. And then the last one we're going to talk about is fawn. So this one is a little bit different because it's not typically an initial trauma response. It's oftentimes a survival mechanism that comes into play after an initial trauma response has not worked. And with this, we think of like a baby animal, right? A baby animal that is dependent upon their parent or some outside source in order to survive. So with fawn, the body really attaches to the harm causing source. So we see this a lot of times with complex trauma that lasts for long periods of time, like childhood abuse or ongoing sexual abuse or domestic violence even. So fawn is at the cross section of safety and high connection. And so high connection is really you're connecting with the trauma causing agent. And this is really like a more complex reaction. In the moment, it can look like negotiation or alliance building, because becoming a friend of the trauma causing agent. At best, it can look like love, service, compromise, listening, peacemaking. Those are all things that we think of when we think of like domestic violence or childhood abuse. But at worst, it can look like servitude, a loss of self, people pleasing. And this reaction is an attempt to mitigate escalated violence, because there's a sense that the violence will increase, right? If there's any kind of attempt to either fight back, to flee, or to fawn. And one thing that we do know is that violence does tend to increase when someone leaves a domestic violence situation, or tries to escape a child abuse scenario or something. That's really when the time that violence does increase. So this is a trauma response that really does protect people, because they know that that trauma will increase, or that this is something that is put into play when all else kind of doesn't work out. So now we want to talk about emotional responses to trauma. So everyone can experience trauma and the emotions that come with trauma, right? That's not unique to anyone. And you all are probably well versed in the ways that people can experience trauma and some of the responses that those might be. You'll see on the screen, like, these are some of the things that you might expect to typically see, right? When you're experiencing trauma, you might typically expect someone to be crying, or to be afraid, or becoming withdrawn. But it's important to know that everybody responds differently to trauma. And this is also true for folks with developmental disabilities. Some key points for us to keep in mind, though, when we're working with folks with developmental disabilities who've experienced trauma. And first is that it's not uncommon for anyone who's experienced trauma to smile or laugh. Like, that is a response that is pretty common, right? People laugh when they're nervous, when they're frightened, when they're hurt. So it's important to know that someone having a reaction like that doesn't necessarily mean that what happened wasn't harmful to them, or that they haven't experienced trauma. And unfortunately, people with developmental disabilities have been wrongly believed to be less traumatized because of their disability. Maybe because their reactions aren't what people expect. Folks feel like, oh, well, that doesn't harm them. When they express distress or trauma differently, instead of getting the support that they're needed to deal with their trauma, they may be considered to be acting out behaviorally. Something else to be aware of is that for folks with developmental disabilities, oftentimes it can take a much longer time for them to recover from trauma without treatment than people with disabilities. So, not only are they not given the treatment, but even with or without getting treatment for their trauma, it takes them a much longer time to recover from the trauma. So it's important for us to understand that the timeline of getting services and supports may be different, because you will need to perhaps advocate for that. If someone is going to a therapist or something for treatment, you may need to be the person that advocates for them getting additional treatment or additional services because of their disability. So we're going to talk a little bit about behavioral change, and this is kind of a sensitive subject. You'll see on the screen here, these are some of the behavioral changes that you may see. But it's really important to remember that behavior is communication. And for people with limited ways of communicating, behavior can really be a powerful tool in showing what you're feeling. So a change in behavior or an increase in behavior that is already typical for someone can really be a red flag that a trauma has occurred. And one that I want to talk about a little more in depth is allegation making. That one is really sensitive because allegation making, right, is like sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, right? So we want to be really careful about this, because what we know about people with disabilities is that they have a very high chance of being abused multiple times and by multiple people. But there's also an assumed lack of credibility for folks with developmental disabilities. And we don't ever want to assume that because someone has had a past experience with trauma or violence, that they don't understand what is real and what is currently happening. But that being said, that does sometimes happen where someone gets confused. So this makes it really difficult for care providers to kind of determine if abuse has happened, which is why it's really important that we are not the ones making those decisions, making those calls, right? Our duty is to report any alleged abuse or suspicions of abuse. So if someone is telling you that something has happened, it is not up to you to decide whether that is true or not. It's up to you to make those reports and allow the professionals who it's their job to make that decision. Because we do know it does happen multiple times, multiple different people causing harm. So we don't ever want to brush that under the rug and say, oh, this person's just confused. They're confusing a past incident with what's current and what's real. But some of the things that you can kind of take into consideration is there a pattern? Is there a consistent theme? So, you know, if someone is consistently not wanting to work with a certain staff member, that might be a red flag, right? Okay. And then for all of these, aggression, injurious behavior, loss of skills, eloping or fleeing unexpectedly, obsessive thoughts, compulsive behaviors. Some of the things that you might want to take into consideration is, are these things new? Has there been an increase in frequency or severity? Is this a response to a specific person, setting, activity, or time? Are there other environmental factors like the sound, light, noise? Is the person exhibiting other unusual behaviors? And do these things come and go? So those are just some things to kind of keep in mind about behavioral changes when it comes to someone either experiencing trauma or identifying when someone has experienced trauma. Now we're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed approaches that are detailed here are realizes, recognizes, responds, and resists. So realizes, you want to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand the paths for recovery. Understanding the vulnerabilities and experiences of trauma survivors, including the prevalence and the physical, the social, the emotional impacts of trauma. And then recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staffs, and others involved with the system. You respond by fully integrating your knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And then most importantly, resisting re-traumatization. And you can do that by remaining non-judgmental. And then what's really important in the community with developmental disabilities is giving back that power and control. And that's something that is really difficult when you're supporting folks with developmental disabilities, because there are so many structures and systems in place that really take power away. But when someone has gone through sexual assault trauma, that is really what is important for them to begin the healing process, is that they're given power and control back over their lives. Sorry, there's a delay on my system. So when thinking about trauma-informed care and how to embody and implement the support a survivor might need, it's important to keep these values listed in mind. So for safety, you want to increase the physical and emotional safety of the survivor. That doesn't always mean eliminating any possibility of danger, right? We know that those are always going to exist, especially when we are trying to support autonomy and people making their own choices. We know that there's always going to be the possibility of danger, but trying to help them to increase their safety as much as possible. And then, just like I just said, choice and control, working on helping the survivor regain a sense of control by like being part of the process and the decision making whenever is legally possible. So we know that mandated reporting, right? That's not something that we can forego. It's something that is legally required, but making sure that we give people as much power and control back as possible in that process. Try not to make choices for the survivor, but help them get the information that they need and understand that information so that they can help, so that you can help them make those informed choices. Collaboration. So we want to create a transparent relationship with the survivor, incorporate additional support systems, and help foster their growth. Trustworthiness. So be clear in these kind of in sexual violence situations, right? We want to be clear about the possible outcomes of the situations and decisions. We want to be consistent and make sure we're keeping good boundaries. If you say you're going to do something, make sure that you do it. It's better to tell the person that you can't or that you're unsure than it is to promise them something and then not deliver. And empowerment. So prioritize, again, decision making and make sure that the person is able to regain as much power and control in order to regain that sense of safety. Okay, shifting perspectives. So in situations that might inspire the question, what's wrong with you? We want to work on shifting our responses as individuals, departments, and systems to what happened to you, right? So things like what's right? What's going on, what's right? What matters to you? What can we accomplish together? Kind of shifting those perspectives from what's wrong with you, because that has more of a victim blaming mentality than what happened to you. So we just want to kind of keep that in mind of shifting that perspective. Survivor-centered approaches. That's one that prioritizes the needs, the rights, and the wishes of the survivors of sexual violence. So survivor has the right to be treated with dignity and respect rather than being exposed to victim blaming attitudes. We want to choose a course of action in dealing with the violence instead of feeling powerless. That's something that we want to make sure that the individual can do, choosing that course of action. They have a right to privacy and confidentiality instead of exposure. So we know mandated reporting, right? We have that duty for a lot of folks, but folks still do have the right to privacy and confidentiality. So you want to make sure you're only reporting to the designated parties and no one else in order to keep that privacy and confidentiality. They have the right to non-discrimination instead of discrimination based on gender, age, race, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation, HIV status, socioeconomic status, immigration, religion, any other characteristic, right? So these are all things that folks face and then survivors may face in more nuanced ways. So we want to make sure that we're supporting people in a way that doesn't discriminate. And then they have a right to receive comprehensive information to help them make their own decisions rather than being told what they must do. So moving from disability responsive to trauma responsive. When we think about providing services, any services to people with developmental disabilities, we know that there are certain things to be aware of, like certain accommodations that may need to be put in place. If you're supporting someone with a wheelchair, right, you might need to make sure that where you're going, there are ramps, that there's an accessible bathroom, those kinds of things. And similar accommodations and supports can be considered when you're supporting survivors. So many of the things may be emotional or verbal supports, but they do involve a lot of forethought and consideration, as well as participation from the survivor. So these are some things that you want to consider and keep in mind as you're shifting to include trauma and its effects into how you provide care. You want to recognize the high prevalence of sexual violence among this community, assess and remove barriers that prevent survivors from disclosing, train your staff to believe people with developmental disabilities and to respond compassionately. That one is really important. Ashley and I have done focus groups with folks with developmental disabilities, and what their responses were, and what most people who experience sexual violence, disability or not, the reason that they don't come forward and ask for help is fear that they're not going to be believed. So the most important thing you can really do to support a survivor is make sure that when someone tells you they've been assaulted, you believe them and you respond compassionately. Train staff to incorporate sexual and healthy sexuality training and healing into existing service plans. And then collaborate with rape crisis centers on protocols to provide prompt survivor-centered services. So here's just a few considerations to keep in mind when providing care. Care providers for folks with disabilities, right? We know that focus is often placed on changing behaviors of folks that they support. And since we know that behavior can change or increase after an assault, it's important to keep in mind that behavior is a form of communication, but it can also be a coping skill. So if you're working to remove what is viewed as like an issue, you may be not only removing their form of communication, but you're also removing the way that they're coping with the trauma rather than addressing that trauma. So that's something that's important to consider. When people with developmental disabilities are incorrectly assumed to experience less emotional trauma, right? So they may not always respond the way that they are expected to, or because people believe that folks with disabilities don't understand what has happened or assume that that impact isn't as great. So this is something that, you know, we talked about a little bit before, but important to keep in mind that people with developmental disabilities do feel trauma. They do have an emotional response to it. Just because it doesn't look like ours doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact. Trauma can be overlooked because it is viewed as like a behavior, kind of like we just said. You know, they might express that trauma differently. So rather than connecting them with help, a lot of care providers may assume that they're acting out or having behaviors and focus on that rather than connecting them with support. So also something that you all might be, you know, are probably really familiar with is that a lot of times people believe that routine is the best medicine for everything when working with folks with disabilities. But after a traumatic experience, what was once their routine may now be something that is a triggering event. So don't be afraid to talk to the survivor about what they're experiencing and see if a change in their routine might actually be something that's helpful for them. And lastly, healing takes a lot of time. So know that, you know, the way someone feels can change day to day and moment to moment. So we want to check in with them about what they're feeling and what they're comfortable with, because healing is a long process and, you know, it can go back and forth. You can think someone is totally fine one day and then the next day they're having a really rough day. So just kind of keep that in mind, that it's not really a linear process, but it can take a long time. And then a few things to remember. Something that we know is really important for survivors is that we believe them, right? This is especially true for folks with developmental disabilities. In our first session, we talked about how folks with developmental disabilities are not really trusted to know what the truth is. And we talked about that a little bit today. So keep in mind that you might be the only person that believes them. right? They may have gone to other people before that didn't believe them. So that is what is one of the most important things to do, is believe people when they say that they've been assaulted. People with disabilities are entitled to dignity, consideration, respect, and rights that you would expect for yourself. As with any survivor, their experiences are compounded by their identities beyond their disability. So recognizing all parts to someone's identity is important to providing the appropriate support. And while the survivor is an expert in what they need, they may not know what services are available. So asking people how you can help, but also be prepared to walk them through potential options. And then also allow lots of time for breaks. So if someone uses assistive technology or uses interpretation, that's going to be even more complex. So you want to make sure that when someone is having a rough time or feeling overwhelmed, that you're adding that extra time in there for them to make sure that they are feeling like they can process the information and get the support that they need without those time constraints. And then I am going to turn it over to Ashley to talk about some trauma-informed practices.
Thanks, Priscilla. So we're going to focus in specifically around trauma-informed practices for mandated reporting. And one of the reasons for that is, for a sexual assault survivor who is over the age of 18 and who does not have a developmental disability, they actually get to decide on their own if they want to involve the criminal legal system. So they can make the decision whether they want to report the sexual assault to the police and involve those systems. With youth and people with developmental disabilities, they are not given that option, right? And that's where mandated reporting comes in. And not being able to make those decisions for oneself can be re-traumatizing. So in practice, mandated reporting is not trauma informed, but there are things that we can put in place to enhance our ability to be trauma informed while we have to legally respond as mandated reporters. So that's what we're going to discuss now. And, as mandated reporters, your duty is to follow the relevant state and federal laws regarding reporting abuse. But when mandated reporting laws were created, there really wasn't any attention paid to the impact that mandated reporting can have on survivors of sexual assault. And so if we can approach the reporting process in a more trauma-informed way, we can actually help the survivor in their recovery and in their healing. And so we can focus on, what decision-making abilities can we actually bring them in to make that will help them feel like they have a sense of control in the process. And of course, if someone is in immediate danger, some of the steps that we're talking about here might not make sense, but the goal is really to involve the survivor as much as possible. And when we did focus groups with survivors of sexual assault with developmental disabilities, one thing that we heard multiple times was that they were never explained the reporting process. Or if they were, it wasn't in plain language. It was using a lot of legal jargon that would be difficult for anyone to understand. And so it was really kind of important for survivors to be given a description of what was going to happen, and also what might happen. As someone who has to make a report, you might not know what's going to happen, right? We don't have a crystal ball. We can't say exactly what's going to happen, but it can be helpful to kind of outline some of the things that could happen, especially for folks who struggle to adjust to new situations. It is important for us to be clear about what will happen and what might happen as best as we can. Of course, we can't control, other people's actions and the way that they do things, but as much as we can share, like, these are things that will happen, these are things that might happen. In plain language, that makes it easier for people to understand and have some sense of idea of what could happen. So, and this is really good practice for anyone, taking into account that not everyone speaks English as their first language. When we're talking about trauma, as Priscilla shared with us earlier, it does impact our brain's ability to function. And so getting a lot of really like legal jargon, complex information when we're dealing with trauma is not useful for anyone. So I would say that we should explain these processes in plain language to any and everyone. So this could be done like not using abbreviations, using shorter sentences and phrases and common words, using active first person voice. So like an example, instead of saying something like APS requires that I make a report, we could say something like, I need to call Adult Protective Services, and then explain what that is. So it's just, again, having to rephrase and kind of be intentional about how we're sharing information. So involving the survivor in the process of reporting, you might wonder, like, okay, how do I do that? What does that look like? And this, again, was something that we heard a lot in our focus groups, was that survivors didn't know what that meant. When someone said, I have to report this, what does that mean? Who do you tell it to? Can they be present? Can they know what you're reporting? Like, those are things that they weren't aware of. And so it could be very helpful to practice describing to the survivor all the people that you're required to inform. And also let them know that beyond that, you're not aware of who they have to inform, right? But you know that you have to inform these people. When possible, you could ask if the survivor would like to be present when you make the report. You could ask if there's anyone that they would like to join the process of reporting to help support them. You could write the report again in plain language so that they are able to, have access to that. You can ask the survivor if you would like to read the written report to them or have them read it themselves. Again, talking about possible outcomes. We can't promise what's going to happen because we just don't know. And there is such a variance in terms of what happens when a mandated report is done, but we can describe some of the outcomes. Someone might come and talk to you. Someone will likely talk to the person that's been hurting you. And we can be very clear with a survivor that we don't know all of the possibilities of what could happen. And then it is important for us, as much as we can, to protect that person's story. So yes, when we're making a mandated report, there are people that you have to tell, obviously, but if we can include as few people as legally possible, that can also be really important and helpful to someone who is healing from trauma. If there are people in the survivor's life, like friends or family members, that they decide that they want to inform and reach out to for support, we can help facilitate that. If there is, someone that they are really close to, perhaps at their day program or a job coach that they want to disclose to, we can, help facilitate that with them, be there for them to do that if it's their choice. It could be someone that they trust to help them make decisions. Perhaps they're conserved. But one of the things that many disability service providers do is report to the families about everything of importance, right? And so that might be something that has to happen, or that's a practice that happens, but informing the survivor that it's going to happen would be important in terms of providing trauma-informed care. It would also be in the possibility that you can do this is to allow adult protective services or law enforcement, if they become involved, to make that decision, unless the survivor actually pushes for you to inform family or a conservator, or if they want your assistance in doing that. It's possible that the conservator or the family already knows that the abuse is happening. It's possible that they are complicit in the abuse, or that they will kind of change access to the individual in the name of protecting them. So these are just things that we want to kind of be aware of. I can share, there have been times in the past where I have had to make mandated reports, and mostly involving folks under the age of 18. And it's a very traumatic decision if they really wanted to tell someone, but they didn't want this whole system to become involved. It can really change someone's life. And so for us to be aware that that is likely an upsetting thing, and then we can try to mitigate some of why it's so upsetting. And if you think about, depending on someone's identity, they might have had bad experiences with systems in the past, whether that's law enforcement or child protective services. Some people have already experienced those things by the time we're working with them, and that can bring up past traumas. And then lastly, it would be really important to be able to provide some type of follow-up care. And so this could be done in, lots of different ways, but what we heard from people in our focus groups was that after the report was done, that was it. They didn't hear anything else about it. And so if you are connected to a rape crisis center, you might want to ask the survivor if they would like to be connected to a rape crisis center, talk to someone from a rape crisis center. If they would like to receive materials about rape crisis center services, you could help facilitate that. The real goal in reporting is to stop the incidents of sexual assault and for the survivor to be safe. But we also want to keep in mind that for many people with developmental disabilities, they might be being abused by someone that they actually live with. And so we want to be careful in giving a brochure about sexual assault trauma, because if they bring that material home, or if someone from a rape crisis center calls them at home, that could cause more problems, and could increase the likelihood that they are unsafe in the home. So it's good to just have that communication to be able to kind of identify when things like that might come up. You could offer to add a hotline number to their phone under a different name. These are all things that unfortunately advocates are really kind of skilled in doing, because the risk of exposing to the person that's actually causing harm can be really high. But it would be great if in the process of doing a mandated report, you were able to describe some of the services that are available to them, and you could even help them access those services. Again, it would be useful to clarify your role as a mandated reporter early and often. A lot of people aren't aware of who a mandated reporter is. That was certainly the case that I ran into when I was working in schools doing sexual assault prevention. Um, when a student wanted to speak with me after a session, I made sure to let them know at the beginning of that conversation that I was a mandated reporter and explained what that meant. That way they could make the decision to the best of their ability, whether they wanted to continue sharing perhaps something with me or not. So, this can be hard when relationships are formed and information is revealed. It would be hard, I think, for all of us if we told someone that we are close to something in confidence to have them respond with, well, I have to go tell someone that now. So it's important that if people are confiding in us, we recognize that that is difficult, and that having to find out later that that is someone unable to keep that information confidential can be damaging to the survivor and also to our relationship with the survivor. So it's good when we're approaching the topic of mandated reporting to make sure that everyone's informed about their own responsibilities as well as who holds the mandated reporter title. So if you are sitting here and you're like, I'm actually not sure if I'm a mandated reporter, that might be your first step, is to just clarify with your organization if you are a mandated reporter, who are the mandated reporters. Regardless of supervisor instruction or opinion, every mandated reporter does have a legal duty to report suspected abuse. And the person who receives the disclosure should be the person who's actually making the report. I know sometimes in organizations that is not what happens, but think about the game of telephone. After you pass it on to so many people, things start to get lost or changed. So if you are the person that has received the disclosure, it is best that you are the person making that report, or you're at least there when the report is made. I would say if a supervisor tells you not to report, you still carry that legal burden. So you would have to make that decision for yourself. If someone else reports for you, I might suggest that you follow up to make sure that that report was completed. And then it's important for us to remember that mandated reporting does not guarantee safety, right? That then puts the responsibility into a whole other set of people's hands. And we can hope that the survivor is able to get into a safer place. But it is true that sometimes the survivor remains in the same environment or has the same relationship with the person that's causing them harm, and they may continue to be abused. So that's something that we have to keep in mind, that just because we make a report, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything's going to change. The survivor may choose or may be forced into a situation that's similar or even worse. And that's certainly something that I think, if you think about what happens a lot with children who are removed from a home because of abuse and then enter the foster care system, we know that there's a lot, unfortunately, of abuse that happens in the foster care system. And so just because we remove a person from a situation doesn't mean that the situation we're putting them in is going to be any better. And that could be true for people with developmental disabilities as well. So, a report, while it can initiate a number of drastic changes, sometimes those changes are actually really uncomfortable and traumatic, even when it is for something better. So we want to just keep that in mind and be empathetic and be patient with the survivor who's actually having to experience all of these changes. We have created tools for disability service providers to help support trauma-informed practices. And so I will drop a link into the chat for these. Give me one moment. So this first tool is it's a guide for staff. We've also created a guide for people with disabilities, and the guide is in plain language, and it's an explanation of the mandated reporting process. So it includes a lot of the details that people with disabilities are not typically informed of when accessing services, such as, who is a mandated reporter? What does that mean? Who do they tell? And this guide is also available in Spanish. And I am just going to give you all of these links. Okay. So there is a link in Spanish. The who, what, when, where, why, and how is the plain language guide to mandated reporting. You'll also, under the all materials link, you'll find additional materials. Some of these materials are specifically geared to rape crisis center staff, but the ones that we're sharing here on the screen would probably be very useful to you all in your roles as disability service providers. So I want to go ahead and pause here for a minute and see if there are any questions that are coming up. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you could raise your hand. I see Bernadette says, recognize trauma may happen to the individual, but may also cause a trauma to those who support them, like the family needing supports. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, finding out that someone that in your family has been hurt in a way, has experienced sexual harm, is really traumatic to anyone. And rape crisis centers often offer services to family members as well. So it's another good a good reason to maybe get connected to your local agency. But yeah, absolutely. There can be, it's kind of like a ripple effect, right? When you throw like a stone in a body of water and it ripples out, that's kind of what happens when someone's experiencing trauma. Okay, so if there are no questions, we want to do just a few minutes in a breakout room to just have you all practice informing each other that you are a mandated reporter and what that means using plain language. You could also inform your group that you'll need to make a report to APS and try to explain what that means in plain language. Doing things like this, kind of like role playing, it just helps us build that muscle memory. And so when we are in a situation, we can hopefully kind of like turn to that, and we're able to guide a survivor in a way that we otherwise would not have. So Priscilla, can I ask you to help me open the rooms? And how much time are we going to give folks for this?
We'll say like 5 minutes. They're small groups. So we'll have you come back in 5 minutes. So let's see, 11:15, that's perfect. And we'll put, Ashley, can you put the prompts in the chat?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi everyone, welcome back. Thank you all so much for participating in that. Just wanted to pause for a minute and see if anyone wanted to share how that was for them, if they felt like it came easy and they have a good kind of idea of how you would explain mandated reporting in plain language. So yeah, anyone wants to share?
Well, we were kind of in the middle of talking about, the question came up. So a lot of times we have scenarios where little patent places are going on in like a day program or a job site, and someone tells someone and then someone else tells. And when you go to talk to the person who may have had the trauma, they may deny it. And I think it's it kind of should be an opportunity to ask more questions and kind of ask a little bit more about what else might be going on. So are they denying it because they don't want it to go further, or are they denying it because it didn't happen, or what's the motivation for sharing it? And it should be an opportunity to try and look at it some more with the person. So it's important sometimes to make sure that not only we're taking information from a third party, like a staff, but we're also talking directly to the client, so we really get their perspective of what's going on. They may not know that it's abuse.
Mhm.
They may not understand what's happening. And so it's important to talk to the person directly. That's
Yeah.
kind of where we started to go.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Bernadette. I think that's a really good point. And that is, one of the things that we'll talk about in the fourth session is that not talking about healthy relationships does a disservice to people with developmental disabilities, because, sometimes it can be difficult for them to recognize what's happening isn't okay. And yeah, sometimes, people there's probably all sorts of motivations for someone, denying what's happening. So I can certainly, sympathize if that's happening, that you would want to try to get to the root of that. Any other thoughts from anyone? All right. Well, thanks again for participating in that. We want to spend the last bit of time with you all talking about community supports. And one of the kind of ways to put these trauma-informed principles into work is to use them as a framework. And so we can use this as a framework for ourselves individually. We could use it on, if we're on a team of people, if we have leadership roles in our organizations, but it could also be used as a way to decide who we go to for community supports. So just want to kind of offer you these trauma-informed principles as a framework for us to ask ourselves when we're making decisions, when we're delivering services, or when we're designing programs. Are we promoting safety, and how are we building trust and transparency with the people we work with? How are we nurturing and growing peer support that might be really important for people? How are we acting and promoting collaboration and mutuality? How are we centering empowerment and choices? And how are we acknowledging and including cultural, historical, and gender issues? So one thing that, sorry, let me change the screen. When we consider everything that someone who's experienced sexual abuse must go through, we realize how important it is to have accurate information about the resources that we're able to offer. The last thing we want to do is add more stress to someone. And so the more that we're able to know about a resource, the less hassle a survivor will have in trying to connect with those services. So being able to know things like the location, the hours of operation, the types of services offered, if they have specific experience working with the population. It would also be really great if we were able to have like a high quality of referrals, and know someone's mission and the program goals, the types of people that they're able to serve, the language and cultural capacity that they might emphasize on, any of their shared goals and philosophies for the people that they serve, and then how they receive referrals. That way, when we're guiding someone in accessing these things, we can do it in a more trauma-informed way. It might also include us, as we begin the process of making a referral plan, to dive deeper into the specifics that would affect the people that we support. So again, wondering if they have any culturally sensitive services available. Do they have other languages that they speak? Perhaps a survivor, prefers a language other than English. Is this organization able to accommodate that? Are there any governmental policies impacting a survivor's residency status, if that is a reality for them? And are there any interpreter services available? The last thing we want to do is, refer someone who maybe uses an assistive device to an organization that has no idea what that even is, right? So sometimes it takes a little bit of footwork on our part to find appropriate referrals. That's also part of what Priscilla and I are doing with rape crisis centers, is trying to build their capacity to be able to provide people with developmental disabilities relevant trauma support. Other things to consider, is this organization or place easily accessible by public transportation? The last rape crisis center that I worked at, we had to move, and the biggest thing that we were looking for when finding a new office space was its location to a bus stop. We had so many clients who were receiving therapy at our organization who use public transportation. And if they were not able to access the office easily by a bus, they would not be able to get services. So that's usually an important consideration for people who are serving communities of the public, but you never know. If, let's say that the organization is easily accessible by public transportation, are they easily accessible for people with disabilities, and what types of disabilities? Are they able to accommodate support people? So, some places might have a hard time having someone attend the service with a support person. And a lot of times, thanks to the last couple of years, services are being provided both virtually or in a hybrid setting. So it's just nice for us to know those things. It's also great to know if there are costs involved, what the average response time is. Some places, if you've ever looked for services, you know very well that oftentimes, there's waiting lists. What does that look like? What are their hours look like? Do they have evening hours? What's the best way to communicate with them? So those are some considerations in trying to, create a trauma-informed practice of referring survivors to other places. We also know that making referrals is more than just providing a survivor with a phone number and a website address. If we are going to make an individualized referral plan, we want to be able to identify key steps towards healing and recovery. And so being really consistent with a survivor-centered approach or a person-centered approach can help us to create something that will not only work for a survivor, but also help them put their needs at the center of any discussion of options that have to be made and problems that may need to be resolved. So helping a survivor identify needs after a sexual assault can be one of the simplest, but honestly, one of the most essential tasks for advocates and for support people, because it's both empowering and practical. Sexual assault survivors will likely have a lot of concerns, and some of those concerns are going to be more pressing than others. Sometimes after we've experienced a trauma, we might hyperfixate on things that we consider a problem that really are not problematic. And so getting into some kind of like crisis counseling can help survivors kind of put those things in the appropriate place in where what they worry about and what they don't worry about. So helping them identify their needs. What are their needs? Is there a housing need now? Is there a need to change what they do during the day? Is there a need to change a job? Is there a need to change living situations? Once a survivor is able to identify their needs, we can also assist in identifying options to get those needs met. And so a trauma-informed way to do this would be to make this a collaborative effort between you and the survivor. Don't be afraid to make suggestions. You might think of things that the person doesn't think of, but it could be really helpful to identify a range of options so a survivor can feel like they are able to make a choice and choose. Because again, when someone has experienced sexual violence, they've really had a lot of their power taken from them. And so to be able to give them options is one way for them to feel that their power is being given back. And then after we are able to have some options and make some decisions, we can make a plan. And making a plan in the aftermath of a sexual assault helps the survivors see that they are actually very strong and resilient, and they have a right to fully participate in society and thrive. This really can set a survivor of sexual assault up onto a pathway towards autonomy. But because the experience of trauma can be so kind of like rattling to our brain system, having a plan and having someone help us make a plan is really important. So there's lots of different types of services in the community that we could help a survivor connect to. And rape crisis centers are one of those places that, of course, we would suggest starting with because they're able to provide that crisis intervention. But there may be lots of other services that would be helpful for a survivor to have contact with. So these are just some examples. And I want to, again, stop right there. We are pretty much at time, so just wanted to see if there are any other questions. We will be providing you with these slides. And yeah, I can definitely stay for a couple minutes if there are any questions. All right, I'm going to put the links again for the first session in the chat and then the sessions coming up. We'd love to see you as we start to now shift from the realities of sexual assault into why is this happening and what can we do to interrupt it? And that will be happening in sessions 3 and 4. But if there are no questions, then I just want to thank you all again for attending today. Thank you to Westside Regional Center. Thank you to our captioners. And we really hope to see you on a future training. Thanks, everyone.